this. If you want to raise a question to the panelists, then please use the Q&A function. And we've also enabled the chat function if you want to just make general comments and network with other attendees here today. But if you do have a question, please do put it in the Q&A. And also, when you're using the chat function, if you want everybody to see it, please click all panelists and attendees. We will also shortly post a behaviour statement in the chat as well, and we will remove people immediately from this webinar that post any racist comments. Now, we have a panel of 4 speakers today, and they will speak for 10 minutes each, and I will let them know if they're going over time, and then we'll have a general question and answer sessions at the end. The hashtag which we are using is hashtag #RaceEqualityHE. So once again, welcome. It's great to have almost 300 of you and counting on this call. And may I first acknowledge that today is the 3rd ever Windrush Day. It is a day for us to reflect, recognise and celebrate the contributions made by the Windrush generation to the rebuilding of this country post-World War II. It's a moment in which I have my own personal pride as a granddaughter of the Windrush generation, but also as a time to recognise the hardships, the prejudice and the challenges faced by the brave men and women, like my grandparents, who responded to the call from England to leave their island nations and rebuild the motherland after World War II. They felt a sense of duty, pride and responsibility, which changed the shape of this country, themselves and their families forever. And we have this discussion about race equality in higher education, where many discussions have been taking place over many years, but have been heightened over the last few weeks. Discussions about decolonising the curriculum to ensure that it embraces the fact that Britain is rooted in Black and global history, achievement and culture, and includes the achievements of Black Britons. A call for anti-racism training to be rolled out, and a push for greater representation in our universities, particularly at the senior levels, where a lot of university boards and senior management teams remain all white. We don't operate in a bubble, however, and it would be remiss of us not to touch on the issues that have dominated our lives over the last few weeks. The murder of George Floyd in America, that have sparked protests across the globe. The Public Health England report that shows that BME people are more likely to die from COVID-19, and that this can be attributed to institutional racism. And the reality that this global pandemic has shone a light on historic racial inequalities that have existed for decades. So to that end, I would like to introduce my first speaker. So my first speaker is Professor Udi Archibong. She's the Professor of Diversity at the University of Bradford, where she directs the Centre for Inclusion and Diversity and provides strategic oversight for equality and diversity across the university. Her research, teaching and knowledge transfer activities cover the areas of workforce diversity, diversity in leadership development, family-centred healthcare, and cross-cultural negotiation of community and family access to and engagement in health and social services. So Professor Archibong will be talking to us today about the impact of the Diversifying Leadership Programme. So Professor Archibong, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sanchia, for that lovely welcome. It's a real pleasure for me to speak today, and happy Windrush Day, everybody. I am so proud to be part of this agenda. I guess the biggest thing for us is really to look at the times that we are in, the disproportional impact of COVID-19 on Black communities, Black and minority ethnic communities. And then above all, I think we are in a tipping point, a point where we all need to just stop and reflect. We've seen what has happened in the US, but the murder of George Floyd, as far as I'm concerned, is just a symbol of the oppression that has faced and has been facing Black people for a long time. And I'm one person that will not let go of this moment. I think this watershed moment is one that we all have to take literal advantage of and make sure that we can also get our voices heard. So today's event is very important for me. What I'm going to do is just give you some highlights from the work that the Advanced HE commissioned us to look at, and we carefully call it cracking the concrete ceiling, because I keep saying to people, when it comes to BME experiences in higher education institution, I think the ceiling is getting so concrete that it's impossible. Sometimes it feels impossible. But above all, the floor is getting so stickier that like people are held down so badly, and then you have a concrete ceiling and you are in the middle trying to make a headway. So what I will do is just try and give a flavor of the things that we found out in this study, but above all, highlighting some of the voices that we picked up, because I believe very strongly that in addition to all the data, the quantitative data, what would really help us in this time is to look at lived experiences, things that people actually feel and live on a day-to-day basis in the higher education institution. The work that we are doing here, I've already mentioned the two areas we wanted to look at was the in-depth and complex experiences of those on the Diversifying Leadership Program of the Advanced HE, and to look at institutional context where these individuals came from. So the Diversifying Leadership Program is a program for Black and minority ethnic academics and professional services staff to really look at specific development to help them to climb the ladder. And we were contracted to just look at those, the experiences of people on those programs. So I'm not necessarily going to emphasize on the specific experience on the program. I will just highlight that, but move swiftly to look at organizational context. So the approach we adopted was very multidimensional. So looking at different elements, like asking the question, what's the impact of the program on individuals, leadership strategies and career progression? But above all, what's the impact of these individuals on the institutional context? So we used different approaches, interviews, survey, using questionnaire, and we interviewed those on the program and interviewed some equality and diversity professionals. So in the aspect about the impact on individuals, impact of the program, so we had an area about reasons for joining, and it felt like most people who came on the program were asked to attend the program. In some instances, you had people who wanted to and asked to attend, but in a majority of cases, people were literally identified and asked to attend. The overall experience of the program was mixed. There were people who really enjoyed the program and the specific components. There were others who were challenged by the light that was shown on things like racism, racial equality and lived experiences around that. The benefits of the program was mixed as well, but people felt that it gave them opportunity to network, it built their confidence, it helped them to look at their identity and own their identity, and it was also an opportunity to expand their thinking and focus. Since the program, we had a few things about how people have changed stuff, but when I talk through some of the experiences, you'll see that there are still barriers to people implementing the things that they learned from the program. And they also suggested some changes to the program. Now, I've just got one quote to summarize how people felt about the course. The course has absolutely changed my perspective, completely empowered me, allowed me to be myself more, and having a safe space to discuss my experience and celebrate my own culture, feel comfortable, bridge the gap between who I am personally and professionally. I learned as a result of the course that one of my professional strengths is my personal background, because I'm bringing something to the role I do. My own research is specifically about my own experience. So this is just the flavor of what a majority of those on the program said. They did make recommendations for how things could be moved around to make it more accessible and to be more impactful for them. But one of the things I want to highlight was some of the key things that came out from people's general experiences in UK higher education. And I think this is very important when we're looking at people's lived experiences. So these are colleagues who've been on this program, cohorts, at least the first 3 cohorts, and the study was concluded last year. So some of the things they said was they were frustrated in not being able to progress as far or as quickly as they would have liked to. And one of the lived experience or the narrative from an individual was, although I have had some limited progression while here, I do not believe that I have progressed as far in my career as I would have liked to, neither achieve my full potential. And these were some of these sentiments was, I think, identified all the way through the study in terms of people's lived experience. For many, there was an overall perception of UK higher education being discriminatory and their own position therein being discriminated against. And I've got an example quote there. I would say that being a BME is very, very challenging in this country. This country values equal opportunity, but there are hidden discriminations. Nobody is like Trump, who spells it out, but it is embedded. Maybe only 0.1%, but this has a big influence. The experience of exclusion is common. And I think this flavor actually, for me, describes some of the experiences that would lead us to a place where only 0.7% of our professors, 21,000 professors in the UK are Black, for example, and 0.27% of them are Black women. So these are some of the things that people were saying, and please, the report, I'll send the link to the report in the chat room so you can go and read the detailed report. But colleagues talked about experiences of microaggressions, prejudicial interpretations, and the quote there represents this. Again, there are opportunities, but again, people don't like to see a BME in a leadership position. There is still that resistance. I have applied in a couple of places, got to interview, but feedback has been that I don't have the leadership skill. But then I find out that the person who got hired when I applied has less qualifications compared with me. Issues of difficulties generating systemic level changes, people talking about changes as being very short term and not systemic. A hidden workplace culture that was inaccessible to BME staff. So we had lived experiences around people not knowing the unwritten rules, not knowing how to play the game, in quotes. And this filtered through throughout the experiences that people shared with us. We also conducted 2 case studies, and I just wanted to highlight a few things from these case studies. So we identified 2 institutions, institution 1 having a high proportion of BME staff compared to the national picture, and the other one having considerably higher proportion. I'm talking about at least 38% of staff in this institution being from a BME background. However, for these 2 institutions, there was vast underrepresentation of BME staff at the highest levels. The median pay gaps between BME and white staff remained very, very high. In one case for higher institution B, these were more than twice the size of the national pay gaps. So these are issues that we are familiar with. From the survey we did with colleagues in these institutions, BME staff in these institutions, they have relatively positive self-rating of their own leadership abilities. So they perceive themselves to have the abilities to be in leadership. They felt they had high understanding of cross-cultural issues. They had attitude towards promotion and careers strategy. So some of the things we hear is people not coming forward. That's not what we heard from this study. Colleagues wanted and always put themselves forward. But when it came to how their understanding of promotion and life in their current department fared, these were relatively negative. So colleagues talked about things like having unconscious bias and discrimination, the importance of who you are regarding recruitment and promotion was never taken on board. Now, aside from this study, when you look, I've spent a little time looking at strategies of institutions, at least 28 institutions, and looked at their EDI strategy. There's something about bringing yourself to the university. We will provide the inclusive environment so that you can be yourself. But most of the things we heard from colleagues was that they were not able to be themselves in their institution. There was a desire on their part to progress their careers. There was a bias in the representation of BME staff on major decision-making bodies in these institutions. They struggled to navigate cross-cultural environments because sometimes it wasn't exactly conducive for them to be themselves. And then the other thing is we interviewed equality professionals within these institutions. So overall, the institutional environment they felt was inclusive and supportive of diversity for both staff and students. However, targeted initiatives and support for students was higher than you would see in the staff body. They talked about gaps in support for BME staff from senior management regarding leadership roles. They talked generally about development opportunities. Some were talking about being denied development opportunities. And again, the flavor of the BME staff and the comments from the equality and diversity professionals for us, we thought were really matched in terms of they also saw these things that the BME staff were telling us. Now you could argue because most of those individuals we interviewed were BME themselves, as you would imagine, but there was a big, I think, parallel between what they were telling us in the interview and what BME staff were telling us. Now we did ask them to give us some recommendations. So the recommendations for the program, most of them have been addressed. But the recommendations they gave us regarding the institutions and UK HE sector, for me, is something that we've heard time and time and time again. Sometimes you feel very, very frustrated that we know what needs to be done. And the big question is, why are we not doing it? And I want to borrow the words of Reverend Al Sharpton, who says that these guys have been putting their knees on our necks for so long. When we allow unconscious bias and often conscious bias and discrimination to be the way that HEIs operate, fair promotion and recruitment to improve the BME staff pipeline was one of the things that they pushed. They said to us, higher education institutions, our leaders need to stop and ask themselves the question, how long is it going to take for us to have more BME colleagues at senior levels? Can we look at our promotion and recruitment processes to ensure that we are not just paying lip service to the things that we have in our EDI strategies, but we really mean it? They also talked about the representation on decision-making bodies. And this for me would link to the fact that sometimes we have what I call the presence, but the presence of BME people in junior roles. So you look at maybe I would say a pyramid, or you look at a triangle. At the bottom, you have a lot of BME staff. They are represented there, but they're not participating because you don't have them at all levels where they can contribute to decision making. So colleagues were recommending that institutions have to look at representation. And I hasten to add that we need to look beyond representation and look at participation. It's okay to have other people bringing in BME perspective, but I kid you not, it's not the same as looking at lived experience, those narratives, the fact that the presence of BME people at all levels will contribute to transformation in organizations. They also recommended that we need to ensure engagement in equality issues relating to race across HEIs. Some of them were talking from comparison with some of the other work that are being done within HE. Athena Swan is a case in time where institutions are all running and falling over each other. But when you compare that with the Race Equality Charter, you can just see the difference. And the big thing they were saying here is, can we please also shine light on race equality, because this is something that has been plaguing our academy for so long. Let's look at engaging and doing more work at race equality. And let's not do just the box ticking, but let's mean what we do. Lastly, they push that institutions should ensure that work on equality issues related to race is promoted to demonstrate a commitment to staff. I think at this point, I'm going to even say that I'm not knocking other activities that are going on. Let's carry on with those activities, but can our intersectional approach be real? So when we're looking at things around Stonewall, how do we bring in race into sexual orientation work? How are we checking exactly how disabled gay people are experiencing things? When we're looking at Athena Swan, the emphasis on intersectionality has got to go beyond just producing a few stats here and there. Athena Swan must demand real intersections even within that submission. So it's not just about looking at gender linear, race linear, sexual orientation linear. How do we bring them together? But the last point I'm going to make before I pass the system back to Sanchia is actually to say that we are at such a point in the history of the world that we need to ask ourselves the question. I'm putting this challenge to every senior leader that has spoken to me since 25th of May, because we were all quiet until we saw the brutal murder of a Black man in Minneapolis. And I'm very pleased that people are ringing up, how can we do this? My issue is, next time you walk into that boardroom and they are all white people, what are you going to say to yourselves in that boardroom about the inequality? Because the big question would be, don't we have enough BME people in our pool that can also participate and contribute to our decision making? So we need to all take that responsibility to ask those difficult questions. And please, let's move beyond Black Lives Matter. That concept has to be ingrained within our institutions. We have to collectively demand action, not just words. And I thank you so much for listening. Thank you. Sanchia?
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much, Professor Udi. So many issues raised there. Brunel does take part in the Diversifying Leadership Programme, but it has to definitely go beyond the programme. It has to go into action, as you rightly say. We'll just take one question for Professor at this stage. Jenny, are you there?
Hi, Professor. Thank you for that. That was very interesting.
One question before we
Hi,
move
can you
to
hear
the
me?
next speaker? Yes, we can hear you, Jenny.
Hi, Professor Udi, we have a question here from Anisha, and she asks you, how do we go about starting these conversations about race to make sure that we have realistic outcomes rather than turning them into a venting session?
Thank you very much for that, Anita. I agree entirely with you, because if we're not careful, we are going to end up in this club where we're all having a pity party. Some of us are feeling really guilty, and then at the end of the day, it's going to be counterproductive. So what I'm recommending to people is that the first action might be in-group reflections. I want to see a lot of homogeneous reflections. I want my white colleagues to ask questions of themselves around white privilege. I want them to think through how they might step out of that and become allies. I want our Black groups to also have that reflection. How can we help ourselves to the point that we're not all screaming victims, but we're being constructive in coming to this solution? And then we get out of our homogeneous dialogue sessions and come into something that I call heterogeneous conversations, where we're going to want each party, all parties, to listen. And it should be a place of healing, a place where people are allowed to say it. I kid you not, the examples that I've heard from my friends on Facebook, on social media, about the things they've been through, but they haven't had that opportunity of even sharing them. So how do we create a space where we can all come together? We're going to have Black colleagues who will share things. There will be white colleagues who will share things, but the aim is about healing. How do we heal together? And then we move from that space to what do we do together to stamp things out, to sustain this anti-racist stance. It's not okay, and you've heard this time and time again, to be non-racist. Anti-racism is about coming out of yourself and your understanding of and your application of actions to actually saying, I will not tolerate it wherever it happens. So how do we travel to that point? Ibram Ken, who has written on how to be an anti-racist, has given us a few nuggets that can help. But there are other works that have been written, my colleague, Kehinde, Andrew, and so on, have written certain things about specific actions that we need to take. But I agree entirely. If we end up in this space where we are reflecting and we sit there and become victims and the guilty, then we've lost it. We need to get out of that very quickly and think through, how do we collectively manage this? And it's not just going to be about us as staff, it's going to be what happens in the classroom. I've heard about decolonization and it's a fantastic thing, but I want to see it real, not just words, not just this campaign that we're doing that is about ticking another thing. How do we get into the roots of our curricula in our universities to bring up our students, equip them to think in this way? So I think it's going to be a long journey, but there are markers, there are places that we can start and continue until we get to a collective real action.
Thank you, Professor. And we will take more questions at the end of the session. Just a reminder, if you have a particular question for the panelists, please do use the Q&A function as opposed to the chat. And talking about white privilege, our next speaker will be talking about that very issue. So Dr. Gulce Ipek is the Equality and Diversity Officer, one of them in my team, and she leads on the work at Brunel of gender and race equality. But prior to joining us at Brunel, she did research that spanned the business case for diversity and white privilege. So Dr. Ipek, I hand over to you at this point.
Thank you for the introduction, Sanchia, and thanks for organizing, and thank you for inviting me. Thanks for everybody who is on this call joining us. So I just quickly share my screen, sorry. Yes. If you can see it, yes. So today I will talk about white privilege, and my case is going to be in the senior civil service. My institutional setting to explain racism is the senior civil service. Many of the points that I raise in this presentation could be applied to other professional institutions such as academia. The senior civil service is particularly interesting case for explaining the subtle ways in which racism is institutionalized, as it is an example for all those professions which deny the existence of historically located power, which is naturalized in the body of white upper middle class male. Because the civil service, as you can see on the screen, insists on neutrality, impartiality, and objectivity. So the whole presentation and data shown here is based on the interviews that I had of current and former senior civil servants and fast streamers, whom I interviewed as part of my PhD thesis that I completed in 2015. I interviewed 50 plus people, including permanent secretaries and other senior members of the staff, to understand how privilege operates. So about the problem of sameness, while it is assumed that the color doesn't matter, it actually does, and the organizational structures are racialized as well as gendered. So racial exclusion wasn't an accident, it was rather the norm. Racial exclusion is a global contract formed within the history of colonialism, and it is formed in various levels, which I referred in my work as the macro, such as the countries, the social, political environment, the society and the law, and then the institutions and the work setting, and the micro level, which I refer to individuals. So, go quickly. Informal exclusion is about the difference from the past of this racial exclusion we talked about. We have now in the UK is that the formality of procedures of recruitment and promotion now extended to include everyone. So the white supremacy is no longer legally preserved, but it is rather a matter of who has the social, political, cultural, and economic privilege. So in the UK, exclusion of Black people is no longer explicit and formally endorsed. Instead, it is much more latent, much more slippery to recognize and name. Actually, the language of sameness has become a tool for social exclusion. So even though BAME people are not formally excluded from the organizations, they are informally excluded by way of not being the perfect fit for the norm. So the senior positions are not reserved for them. They are outsiders. You can see the source from the Civil Service Diversity Inclusion Dashboard from 2019. It shows all the grades and the change in the BAME representation in those grades until the senior civil service. It starts, frankly, it starts on the 2010 when I started doing my PhD. You can see that there is some progress. Overall, 12.7% of civil servants are from ethnic minority backgrounds, and the overall percentage and the percentage in every grade has increased since 2010. But that increase is pretty slow. So there is progress, but that progress goes very slow, and we need to understand why it's slow, and we need to act on that. So in order to do that, we need to understand informal structures, which slows down this process. Because in formal procedures, you can see that civil service has one of the longest history of policy development in diversity and inclusion. But as you can see, the progress is slow. And also from the report from civil service, this same report says that ethnic minority staff report higher levels of discrimination, bullying, and harassment than white staff. So they tend to score slightly lower of the inclusion and fair treatment, the team score as well. We were talking with Sanchia the other day, this case is worsening as well in NHS, in senior management, and as well as in higher education, still remains a sector with significant diversity challenges. So these challenges are quite common. Some markers of privilege that I've derived from my thesis about race are shown here. And I'll try to discuss briefly examples for each to explain operation of privilege through informal structures in the workplace. So if we move on to discussion about outsiders and insiders, racism in the civil service, in common with other professions, is rarely blatant. So the qualities of leadership in general are associated with white people. Seeing a non-white person in a senior position, people become confused, and because the authority is associated with white people. It is important to reflect on the intersection of gender and race here in this example, as the structures are simultaneously gendered and racialized. So this confusion increases when the Black candidate is also a woman. As the person in senior position isn't imagined to be non-white, often the Black senior civil servant is imagined to be much more junior than they actually are. This is a form of racist practice whereby Black people are simply imagined to be capable of much less than their white colleagues. The merit system of recruitment and promotion offers a formal route of access to civil service, all the formal routes that we mentioned, but actually equally coupled with cultural norms, which may limit access to development of particular careers for certain groups. So the parameters of the organizational culture are defined by the insiders, which then shapes those principles of merit. As you can see here, BAME people are usually reminded through various practices that they're out of place, which in the civil service interviews, I heard the word a lot, the outsiders, that they're not the natural occupants of these positions. The outsider minority ethnic individuals in organizations do not share those implicit codes of behavior. So the unofficial code of keeping certain groups in and certain groups out or down is here. Visibility, on the other hand, is vital for the career success. For all civil servants to get noticed, you have to get your face known. Being in the right place and knowing the right people is the key. So high-profile jobs can give civil servants the right exposure amongst other people similar to other liberal professions, such as the law and the academia, the same and common, where reputations are primarily built through a bureaucratic network. Access to informal networks can be vital for career opportunities. While with the interviewees who are white middle class expressed their success as mostly being in the right place at the right time, both men and women. Black and minority ethnic individuals mostly mentioned how much they had to put effort in and how many years of struggle they had to go through. So since Black people are not expected to be in senior positions, they're under pressure to do well and prove that they're capable of doing the job. Senior civil servants are much more likely to doubt their competency. They really had to be exceptional at every case. Even if they're perfect in their jobs, any difference is picked up and amplified. So Black senior civil servants are constantly under a spotlight. In such a setting, formal rules of behavior, impression management become more important to be in as an insider. So learning those codes of behavior is the key. We had this discussion with my interviewees, like outsider, insider, how you learn the rules of the game and become an insider. So learning those codes of behavior is the key. And these codes of social differences are defined and enforced by the dominant male middle-class whiteness. So subtle codes are the discriminatory practices through which organizations are formed. Outsiders are differentiated and judged and measured in their ability to embody these codes. We keep talking about inclusiveness in the workplaces, and workplace inclusion is when people feel valued and accepted in their team and in the wider organization without having to confirm. So inclusive organizations should support employees, regardless of their background or circumstances, to thrive the work. So to do this, they need to have practices and processes in place to break down these barriers to inclusion, and importantly, they need to value those differences. However, BAME individuals are facing assimilative pressures to perform white middle-class customs and manners at the cost of repressing their ethnic identity and mimic whiteness. People are more likely to be heard if they speak in the legitimate tones, and language has an important role of designing senior roles, social hierarchies. It can be central to authority. The legitimate language is the preserve of the upper class and can be acquired by those who are not part of this class through the educational system, particularly public schools and Oxbridge examples in the UK. And the legitimate language is simultaneously racialized. So competency in the language, when the white in British organizations opens its doors to post-colonial individuals, it has a strong preference for those who have assimilated the legitimate language, as I've come across in many examples from my interviewees. And the legitimate language plays a decisive role in the selection of Black candidates in elite positions in all organizations. Studying at Oxbridge would teach that, probably, and the specific class version of English carries symbolic power. Studying in a public school can help to feel comfortable in the senior civil service. And I kept hearing the word confidence and how they're so confident in assessment centers and people who are raising to senior civil service being expressed as confidence, which is again defined by the white dominant group. As how can you define that confidence or the impression of that? Speaking Oxbridge type or writing Oxbridge type gives the comfort, as the interviewees explained. However, the value codes in the competency framework that were described in the narrations of the interviewees included subjective values and norms such as this confidence and emotional intelligence, among others. And so I wanted to question the emotional intelligence. So we need the organizational structures for this to be reviewed, because when I asked about this emotional intelligence, it was obvious that it was defined by these subjective values and norms. So it wasn't accurate for defining objectively. So in order to be more inclusive in the organizations, we need these structures to be reviewed, which can ensure Black talent and excellence. And we need all staff members in organizations to be aware and trained in inclusivity and have the commitment from the senior civil service or senior teams in any organization. And we need the perception to shift. And we need this work to be undertaken by white people or dominant group in every organization. And they need to be involved in every effort of inclusion. So how you define and articulate inclusion will determine how it is received by colleagues, and how you define and articulate meritocratic principles will also help and improve the inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gulce, for that presentation. Obviously, a lot of people at this time have been looking at white privilege and maybe not thought about the privileges that have been afforded them. And it's really good that you've sort of highlighted some of the pertinent issues. I remember taking part in your research, and I know it was focused on the civil service, but obviously issues translate across the piece. Yinka from my team, can we check if we have one specific question for Gulce at this time?
Yes, we do. We've had some really great questions come in, but one that stood out was if you have any specific examples of a quality associated with leadership that is also associated with whiteness.
So the main ones were from that were the confidence and emotional intelligence, which were quite subjective, and is the question for an objective kind of explanation from the competencies, like the leadership skills as expressed, being confident and emotionally intelligent. They are referring to all this whiteness and being created in that dominant group. So they come with their own cultural backgrounds.
Okay, thank you, Gulce. Just a reminder, if you do have a question for the panelists, do use the Q&A function. And once all the panelists and speakers have spoken, we will then go to a general Q&A. So our next speaker is Professor Paul Miller. And he is director of education. He's an educational leadership and social justice expert and president of the Commonwealth Council for Educational Administration and Management. He has written significantly on the racism faced by overseas trained teachers and teachers of BME heritage. So he will be talking about that this morning. He's also a former colleague of ours at Brunel. So it's good to see you again in an online space. So Professor Miller, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sanchia. Morning, colleagues. And just want to say to the fellow panelists, great work, very interesting findings. I want to talk a little bit about career progression for teachers. And teachers is a broad umbrella term, including academics in the UK or in England in particular. But what I'm trying to do is to help the field to make sense of how some BME teachers progress and the conditions under which they do so. We identify a lot of the barriers, but it's also important for us to, as a counter narrative, but also as a responsibility to the field, try and understand the stories of those who progress and the conditions under which they progress, whilst also trying to help use those case studies to present some kind of guidance for the organizations who need to be leading change in this area. So just sort of a contextual slide there. The HESA figures shows that we have a total of just under 1.8 million students in the UK. And when we look at the number of BME academics and BME students, we see the figures are very, very different. So if we look at these figures for our white students, we are seeing 1.4 million students, and we are seeing 164,000 white academics, which works out at about, in ratio terms, about 8:1. And if we add all the different categories of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic, excluding other and excluding unknown, we have for Black, Asian, and minority ethnic students, we have the ratio is 15:1. So just thought I would present that slide looking at the population of students, but also the academics as a ratio of that. And then also want to talk about the factors and the barriers in the progression. A lot of research has been done, but what I've done here is try to bring everything together in a kind of a literature review, which was published earlier last month, that looks at 5 sets of factors that influence the progression of BME teachers and academics. And we see we have policy, education policy itself, or the law is discriminatory. For example, in some research I did, I found that the Equality Act, for example, is rather problematic, and I'll come back to that later on. But also, if we take the issue around overseas trained teachers who come to the UK, whose qualifications are treated very differently than white colleagues here, or colleagues who come from other white developed industrial economies, and therefore who don't have to do qualified teaching status and so on, then we see that the law advantages some and disadvantages other. And then, of course, there's a whole issue around race discrimination and racialized experiences in organizations. And of course, institutional practices. I think a lot of the research is now beginning to focus attention on the institutions. A lot of the research previously focused on individuals, what individuals did or what individuals didn't do. But now we are realizing that the field is saying, well, actually, individuals are not necessarily the problems, or they are not entirely the problems, or a problem to be fixed, but there are problems in institutions, in HR systems, in boardrooms, in panels, and so on, that really needs tackling. And then we see the group membership that was talked about by the two previous speakers. There are some networks that exclude, and there are some networks that include. And sorry, for BME colleagues, it's usually the networks that exclude. And then Saida Shah and Asima Iqbal have written about the fact that if you are Muslim in particular, then you stand even a harder time or a reduced chance of progression. So, and in particular, if you're male and Muslim, so not just Muslim, but male and Muslim. So they argue, in fact, Saida Asima Iqbal raises the provocative question, is religion the new race? And I mentioned in the previous slide about the Equality Act, and I want to just talk about this a little bit. So we have this wonderful instrument called the Equality Act, but the Equality Act says it's illegal for institutions to discriminate against any person based on a set of protected characteristics. But ironically, whereas the Equality Act says nobody can be discouraged, based on these protected characteristics, the Equality Act also makes it clear that it is illegal for institutions to take the protected characteristics into account in appointment processes. And therefore, I argue that the Equality Act then is an instrument regarded for the promotion of equality of access, but the Equality Act itself does not guarantee any different outcomes. And therefore, the Equalities Act could be seen as a lock and a key in that it promotes equal opportunities of access, but a lock in the sense that it does not deliver equal opportunities of outcomes. So it's a really interesting thing. And if we might recall that under the 2000 Race Relations Amendment Act, for example, institution had a duty placed on them to recruit on race in their profiles for students and staff and so on. But the Equality Act removed that duty, and therefore institutions no longer have to report on race profiles. So that is why I strongly argue that this act then is problematic. And unfortunately, I think there are many leaders, educational leaders and others who would say, well, the law says you cannot take the characteristics into account, and therefore they do absolutely nothing. So what BME communities are not asking for is positive discrimination, but what the act promotes and allows is positive actions, and a lot of people are still wondering what positive actions are. So in some research I've done previously, I have developed this typology about institutional interaction and BME staff progression. And I classified, based on that research, 4 types of institutions. And I want you to think about your institution, what type of institution that you lead. If you're a leader, what type of institution you lead in, what type of institution you work in, what type of institution you study in. But in an engaged institution, they are being from the boardroom to the post room to the canteen, all levels. In an experimenting institution, there are few BME staff in post, but even fewer BME staff in leadership roles. In an initiated institution, there is a framework to meet the legal duty placed under the 2010 Equality Act, but there are few BME staff in post, but certainly none at senior level. And in an uninitiated institution, there is no framework to meet the legal duty, and there are no BME staff in post. So there are 4 types of institution, and my pitch to you would be to look at which institution you work in, which institution you lead in, which institution you study in. So I've done 4 studies that I want to try that I've used to look at some theoretical framing around this thing of BME staff progression. And in 2 of the studies, I discovered there was this issue of agency, that BME staff who progress are increasingly agentic. And it doesn't mean that those who haven't progressed are not agentic. It just means that what I'm seeing is a lot of agency. So, you know, we're seeing somebody saying here, I've applied for 15 jobs, and some people keep telling me, you know, you can't just say you're qualified. That alone won't get you appointed. You have to be part of a club. But I keep telling them no, because I believe in the integrity of the system. So after 14 knockbacks, you think this person would give up, but no, they keep going and they keep going. We also see from study 3 that there were activism. People were collaborating with other BME people. They were having events such as these seminars and making noises. And as we see, Black Lives Matters and so on. And of course, they were forming networks and brokering on behalf of each other, including networks with white colleagues and so on. In another of the study, or 2 of the studies, what came out strongly as well was that being part of an in-group or a network or a club, whether it was formal or informal, was really important, such as going to the annex, and the annex is the pub, or the word annex is the code name for the pub. But progression was based on social capital, the issue of who you know or who knows you, rather than your skills and qualifications, the cultural capital that anyone possesses. And of course, it was believed that, you know, completing certain programs organized by the government, like the HEA Fellowship or Equality and Diversity Fund programs, could provide access, because you're seen as becoming part of a club. You're a part of a specialized group. And then, rather problematically from study 2, there was this notion of appeasement, where overseas trained teachers and teachers of BME heritage, including us who work in academia, felt they had to prove themselves, because to prove themselves, in proving themselves, they felt like that would increase their chances of promotion, since proving themselves allowed them to be better understood. And this is where Marilyn Fry discussed this as behaving whitely. So people had to adapt and appease, but to be your authentic self would almost be problematic. So people talk about wearing the pinstripe suit, or people talk about you know, particular language codes, or the spiky hair, in particular for men. But to be your authentic self would almost count against you. And then in another study I did, I came out with this concept of white sanction, where colleagues could progress if they were endorsed by white colleagues. But of course, it's not just any white colleague. It had to be, and although all white colleagues are born with white privilege, or the privilege of being white, then it has to be a colleague, a white colleague, who has a particular position, a position of respect, a position who can broker on their behalf, who can mediate on their behalf. So the colleague who has the pleasure of being born Black or BME needs to then be endorsed by the colleague. So I describe this as white sanction. And I argue that white sanction gives two things: legitimacy and also enabling. And so the white colleagues use their power to confer on the Black colleague or the BME colleague legitimacy, and in turn, legitimacy then confirms enabling. So doors are opened. If a white colleague says, you know, that Paul Miller is all right, you know, then maybe other white colleagues will believe that. Or if a white colleague says, well, you know, that Paul Miller is a problem, then you know what that means. I also argue that in a system of equity, there would be no need for white sanctions. So let's just get that clear, that I'm not advocating for anyone to sell out their souls. What I'm saying is, looking at the data, then that is what we are seeing, that BME colleagues, it's impossible for them to progress without a white colleague advocating for them, or if there are sufficiently large number of Black colleagues in spaces. And the final study was looking at positive actions, which came out last year, and we saw head teachers using their power, their positions to transform education systems, and they are saying, well, actually, we can do more. We have opportunity here. We are leaders. We have the responsibility here, and I think it's important. So I thought it would be important then to share the studies and what they found before I showed you the model that I've developed around this work. And so within this model, I'm arguing that BME staff progress under 4 conditions. So the first set of conditions you have is this proactive agency. It's called meritocratic agency. So colleague believes that on the basis of my work, I will get my due reward, because the system says if you study hard and work hard and play fair, then the system will be delivered the promised goods of education to you. So that is a proactive and meritocratic agency. But then there is also contrived agency, where you have to now join groups and affiliations, and you have to adapt and appease, because you have to behave whitely, you have to, you know, go to the pub and the annex and so on and so forth. So this is I argue here, it's a reorientation or a reinvention of self, and it's responsive to barriers to progression in you know, problems in your way. So then it forces you to become somebody else. And then there is white sanction, which is the use of white allies. And of course, there is that thing about the institutional habitus. So I argue that BME staff progression is arranged around those kinds of things. And I set it out here, a factor alignment model, to say that meritocratic agency, which is point A, the belief in the system can only get you so far and no more. But, you know, white sanction, contrived agency, and endorsement, they can even get you a little bit further up the ladder even. And many of us who are in the positions that we are in at the moment, we would have benefited from one or a combination of some of these factors, A, B, A, B, C, A, B, A, C. And then in the ideal world, I argue here that actually factor A, which is meritocratic agency, needs to combine with institutional habitus, with an institution which values diversity, race diversity, with an institutional practice that says, well, actually, everybody matters and everybody matters equally. So in an ideal world, the only 2 things you need are somebody's skills and capabilities and an institution that secures that and helps. You wouldn't need expedient agency, or you wouldn't need white sanction. So this then brings us to this new bit of work that I've been doing, because a lot of people are arguing, you know, who's responsible, what you know, and I do think it's leaders. And this is the latest bit of work that I've been doing, thinking around this. So I argue that there are 5 types of educational leaders, or leaders, and 3 categories. You could think of this as ISA, the thing in the bank, ISA. So there is the indifferent leader who says, well, racism or race discrimination is not a problem in our school. So they prioritize performativity agendas. So they're living in a kind of a bubble. And I've known some head teachers, and I've worked with some of those head teachers in schools in the Cotswold and other areas, that they think, well, we haven't got 1 black pupil or 1 black staff, so racism is not a problem here. So they are indifferent. But then you have the sympathizers. And then within the sympathizers, you have 2 sets of head teachers here, or 2 sets of leaders. The passive sympathizers, they acknowledge that there is a problem, but do nothing to address it. Or they argue that they do not know what to do or how to do in order to tackle it. But more worryingly, they do not seek help to tackle it. But they do acknowledge that there is a problem. And then you have the performative sympathizers, and these are the real problematic ones, because the performative sympathizers, they acknowledge that there's a problem. They commit to help or to invest in a minimum solution, but the intervention is usually derived from self-interest or own interest. So there's an element there of interest convergence, or what Giddens calls democratic racism. So your head teacher will, or your vice chancellor, whoever will come and say, yes, there's a problem and let's do this. But you think they are actually doing this because they get the problem. Actually, they are doing it because it's a tick box for them. It makes them look pretty, or it silences you, but it's just that you don't know that. So you're happy that your leader is doing something about this problem that you have. And then you have the activists. You have the accidental activist who says, well, actually, there is a problem here. They are committed to making some form of intervention to tackling it. They may not know how the thing will turn out. They may not even have a clear plan, but what they are clear about is that it cannot be business as usual. So their commitment is clear. And then you have the deliberate activist, and the deliberate activist says, well, actually, this is a problem, and we need to sit down and work carefully. There's a personal commitment. There are resources committed, financial, human, and time, and so on. And there are planned interventions, and this is what is needed to make it work. And so in that 4th study I mentioned before I switched slides, that was the positive action study where I researched the head teachers, 24,281 head teachers in this country, and I could only find 3 head teachers who actually took a methodical, clear, deliberate approach to tackling BMA on the representation and staffing in their schools. So unfortunately, the deliberate activists are few, and of course the sympathizers and the indifferent leaders, unfortunately, are many. I talk about how do we change this, thick equity versus thin equity. I won't go through all of that, but it's to say that we need to move from light touch interventions to deep interventions. And I'll end with just another thing, that, you know, where leaders fail to commit themselves enthusiastically and visibly outside and within their institutions to supporting, investing in, and in some cases leading race equality initiatives, or where they fail to appoint individuals with a passion and a clear mandate for tackling race inequality, the content or the focus of these initiatives may not be realized. And as a result, I argue that doing race equality is serious business, and not all institution can approach this or does approach this with the same interest required in order to make demonstrable change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Miller. That is such in-depth research that really shines a light on how Black staff across education have to navigate their way through and up the system. And you wouldn't have seen, but the chat is going absolutely crazy with praise for this research. So thank you for taking that time to do it and share the models with us. Jenny, I'm just going to see if there's one particular question for Paul before we move on to our final speaker.
Hi, Professor Paul. Thank you very much. I have one question here from an anonymous attendee. Is how do we redefine what a workplace is that is inclusive for all people without creating a multi-tiered system with varying expectations for different groups?
I think it's important that we recognize that we need equity in all our institutions. And one of the problems that has emerged in the discourse around diversity, for example, and EDI and so on, is that the quotidian experiences of Black people have become subsumed under that. So when you look into panels or other things in organizations and people talk about diversity, we've got a female, and that's usually what diversity means from many organizations, unfortunately. So I do think that the thinking needs to be joined up, and issues around gender, race, sexuality, religion, and those things need to be looked at individually, very deeply, very meaningfully. But I also agree that any kind of joined up approach need not subsume the voice of any of those protected groups.
Thank you so much, Professor Miller. So on to our final speaker. I'm pleased to introduce Lord Simon Woolley, who is a political and equalities activist. He is the founder and director of Operation Black Vote, who I've had the privilege to work with over the last 16 years. Can't believe it's just flown by. And the advisory chair of the government of the UK Race Disparity Unit. He has been a crossbench member of the House of Lords since October last year. And Lord Woolley will give us an update on the work of the Race Disparity Unit. So Lord Woolley, over to you.
Thank you. Please, Sanchia, Simon. will do. And
I have to respect the title because I know what it took. You didn't just get given that title just like that.
Well, thank you. And I actually want to pay tribute to you. This is a wonderful event, and you have so many great speakers, so many knowledgeable presentations that I've just been scribbling notes all the time. It's such a wealth of knowledge, insight, passion.
Absolutely.
That puts people like me. Paul talked about deliberate activist. Paul, I would like to think I'm a deliberate activist, fighting for 25 years for social and racial justice, and I hope that you would approve. And I'm also very impressed.
Absolutely.
You've got, Sanchia, nearly 400 people to come together to have this discussion. And I'm sure that it will cascade even further. So we must pay credit to you. Listening to Professor Udi and Dr. Gulce and yourself, the stories, the narratives, the data, it almost makes me want to cry. That all of you have laid bare the uncomfortable truths that continue to lock talent out. And whether it's in the civil service or at the education system or employment, time after time after time, it's a rigged system. It portrays itself as meritocratic. But I thought Dr. Gulce's outline of the way the subtleties lock people out. I spoke to a civil servant recently, and he said to me exactly what Dr. Gulce was saying, that those that have the best projects are the ones that often get elevated. So, if you're with a sexy project and it's got all the limelight, but the managers choose who gets these projects. And it's them choosing their friends, and those that look like them keep going up, and others are stapled to the bottom. But in this moment, this is why this conversation is so important right now, because what we've seen over the past 12 weeks or so has been a perfect storm. A perfect storm which has two elements. One over here, COVID-19, and the devastating impact that it's had on Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities. And the other side is the death of, the brutal murder of George Floyd. I think the collision of these two effects have caused convulsions right across the globe, and particularly in Western societies. And what these two elements have laid bare is the deep-seated racial inequalities that are applied. I mean, we might crudely call them white supremacy, is the first thing. And when you look at COVID-19, that has laid bare these inequalities. Some people have said, Sanchia, that COVID-19 is a racist disease. That's why you've seen the disproportionality of Black deaths. I profoundly disagree. This disease doesn't target race, but it does target areas in our society that are deeply racialized. What do I mean by that? Well, when you look at those that have died in the health service, in the care service, in the essential workers, many of those have been on low pay, and many more have been in 0-hour contracts. So take care workers, for example. Many of those that died will have had little or no choice but to put themselves in the danger zones, because if they didn't get paid. And if you don't get paid, you can't pay your rent and you can't put food on the table. So they were forced to be in these areas. And so when you see that 30% of care workers are BME that died, it's no surprise. Doctors almost being forced to be in danger zones. Many of them over 65, many of them with underlying health conditions. Is it a surprise? 90% of those doctors that have died, Black, Asian, and minority ethnic. It's heartbreaking. And then, of course, when we go to George Floyd, I think what's interesting about that, it wasn't just the knee that killed George Floyd, as Professor Addy mentioned. It's the American system. The American system gave tacit agreement for law enforcement to treat Black people, African Americans, Latin Americans, at the extreme, worse than animals. And when a human being with his hand behind his back and a knee on their neck tells you, I can't breathe, and if you can't breathe, you can't live. And the officer and his accomplices let that happen. That is the system of white supremacy that kills Black people. And there's a gradient. I mean, that's the worst extreme. The gradient of that extreme is poor housing, low paid jobs, poor health, etc., etc., etc. And we know it's not just in the USA that occurs. Actually, it's right in the Americas. That's why we're seeing the shocking deaths in Brazil and the other Latin American countries, but also here in the UK. Let's not be in denial about that. And right across Europe. And in this perfect storm, we've seen an earthquake, if you like, of Black people coming to the street and not asking for change, but demanding it. Not asking to the tweaking around the edges, but radical change, the structural change that uproots the rottenness that has built our society, that institutionally locks people out. You know, our biggest challenge to date that we have to confront is not so much that our society, our institutions are built on white supremacy. It's the denial of it, the starting point. Now, I don't know whether you can see this picture. I want to show you a picture. I want to show you a picture and I want you to cascade it down. I've just tweeted about it. And our tweet, by the way, is at OP Black Vote, OP Black Vote. But I'm going to show you a picture. I'm going to show you, it's a medal. It's a medal that is given by the Queen. It's one of the highest medals in the honours system. It's given to ambassadors, those in foreign policy. And it's an award for doing what you do. And of course, when I show you this, that it kind of sums up, if you like, what the mission has been and what it propagates today. So the past builds the present. Some of you may have seen this, and I hope that you can see it. It's the highest medal in the country today. And I'll put it up in our mirror. There. Can you see? So there's a white knight with the wings, of course, and a knife. It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. We have a system that is being institutional George Floyd murder. This is not one rogue police officer. This is a system. And the mission was to stand on a black man's neck with a knife in your hand and dominate and steal. And with those riches, we'll build a financial system, we'll build an education system, second to none in the world, to continue that status quo. I know that sounds shocking, and I know that it sounds heartbreaking, but consider this for a second. The money from 200 years of slavery, 200 years of colonialism, and then 50 years of deep race inequality. You put that money into the starting point of our education system. Eton College, Harrow, Rugby, Oxford, Cambridge. And then you produce students that can be the captains of industry and in Parliament. And they then will send their children to those schools and to that system. Now, many of you will say, well, you know, Simon, don't get too carried away. That's a long time ago. But consider this. In 2018, there were eight public schools that accounted for more than 50% of the Oxbridge intake. 8. In comparison to 2,900 state schools. So you see where this cycle goes, how the status quo maintains. Those elite, locked in, the overwhelming vast majority locked out. But what those people who have demonstrated have done, they've forced this nation to have a conversation. They've forced this nation to look at the uncomfortable truths on the great in Great Britain. I know great is a geographical sense, but you know, Rule Britannia is part of the narrative. And the system that has caused most pain is still intact today in those key tenets. And what your wonderful, wonderful academics have done. I mean, you know, I just can talk about the big stuff, and they talk about the granularity. The question is this, and I really want to have a broader discussion, and so questions and answers. But the question is this, and the question that historians will ask when they look back at this monumental moment of COVID-19 and George Floyd. They will ask but one question. What was our response? And I think we have one of three answers. We do nothing, we do a little, or we do something bold, brave, dynamic, that shakes up this system as never before. And I think we've never had a better timing to have the radical conversation. And I would argue that this is why this is the right time. As you can see, I'm going grey, not as young as I'd like to be, trying my best to keep young. But I've never seen a moment in which white people, for the first time that I've seen, have been able to glimpse a world in which black and brown people are so deeply prejudiced against. So when they saw the pictures of the doctors and the nurses and the care workers and the bus drivers and the security guards dying, and we saw their faces every day, I think they instinctively said, something's not right. Something's going profoundly wrong. I think when they saw our brother die in front of our eyes, some people said, that couldn't happen to white people. White people said, that couldn't happen to me. It couldn't happen to us. And so we haven't got to be at that starting point where we're saying, believe us when we tell you something is profoundly wrong. Many, I'm not sure if enough, but many, and thank heavens for the Black Lives Matter campaign, are now saying, Simon, we know something's wrong. How do we change it? And that's that moment where all of you, all you professors, you've got these goals and objectives for institutions. You know what I say to them all? Have a look at them and then throw them in the bin. Because we've never been ambitious enough in wanting the demands that we know will no longer just tweak around the edges. And we're conditioned. We're conditioned to tweak around the edges. Forget it. Now the time is to be bold. Make those serious radical demands to our educational bosses. No, or so few black professors, so few black vice chancellors, so few black teachers. Now's the time to make the demands. Now's the time to be leaders. We're all leaders, by the way. Own that space. Paul, you talked about the undeliberate and the deliberate. Now we need to be deliberate activists. Deliberate, focused, together. This is our moment, Sanchia. You're a beautiful leader. This is our moment. We've got to seize it, and I hope that we do.
Thank you so much, Lord Simon Woolley. Again, as I say, I think it's so right to say that this is our time for action. We've had so many reviews and so many discussions over the years. We've got the frameworks in place, and now is the time to make a change. I'll just check with Yinka if there's a specific question for Lord Woolley, and then we'll open up for some time just before we're due to finish at 1 o'clock to the general Q&A. So Yinka, is there something specifically for Lord Woolley, please?
Yes, there is, Sanchia. So it's a two-pronged question here in terms of, do you feel we need another commission and what should be the next steps for the government. And also was asked, does he feel that the Black Lives Matter movement will help make a change for Black people?
Well, first of all, protest is a precursor for change. We've never spoken more about our colonial past, our slave past in the last 10 days than we have in the last 10 years. And that's because people have taken to the streets. What was the other questions? Sorry.
Do we need another commission?
Oh, yeah. Well, only if that commission is focused on what is the framework for solutions, not do we need any more information? And there's some very low-hanging fruit which can be implemented right now. And that is, there's been 11 commissions or reviews about race inequality. Have a look at the recommendations and implement them, for heaven's sake. We have in the government department the ethnic minority pay gap reporting. Now, it's not a silver bullet, it's not a magic wand, but by implementing it, you will begin a process of big businesses having to lay bare who they employ and where they're employed, and what is the plan to close the gaps. In regards to education, we have to be honest and have a review of the Eurocentric history curriculum and change it. We have to have a plan to have more Black teachers. We're short of about 40,000 Black teachers. And here's the point, with all these initiatives, with all these plans, when you put them into action, this is not a zero-sum game. Oh, let's help Black people at the expense of white people. No, everybody benefits by opening up talent, pipelines for talent and creativity. Everybody benefits. It's just about political will. And bearing in mind that political will is also for the universities. Political will. They'll say yes, 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 yes. And in reality, nothing changes. Come on.
Thank you, Lord Simon Woolley. So now I want Yinka and Jenny to sort of help us to facilitate. We've got just over 20 minutes. We'll try to get as many questions in as we can before the finish time at 1 o'clock. So Jenny and Yinka, I'll sort of hand over to you and I'll chip in where necessary.
Thank you, Sanchia. Hi, we have a question here from Kevin for the panel. What can we do to maintain and improve our resilience and well-being in the face of such injustices in the educational system?
Who is that question for, Jenny?
Can you repeat again, please? No, I mean, it was for the panel, but can you please repeat again? Thank you.
Jenny?
What can we do to maintain and improve our resilience and well-being in the face of such injustice in the educational system?
Who was that question for, Jenny?
To the panel.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Whoever would like to answer.
Professor Miller, can I start with you perhaps?
Yes, and thanks for that. Now, I think if we look back at one of the studies that I did, two of the studies, the 2014 study, where this gentleman was talking about, you have to keep going. You have to believe in the integrity of the system. Even though they say you have to be part of the club, I don't want to be part of any club. I want to believe that the system will deliver for me. So I think it's really important that we can't be naive to what is happening, but we still need to be thinking wholesome thoughts. Otherwise, we are going to be sucked into a kind of mire and becoming very angry and almost to the point where our anger and disillusionment makes us, you know, probably exit the profession that we love, or even picking up arms when actually the arms should be a different kind of advocacy. So it's really important that we try and keep a sense of perspective, but also keep hope alive. As well, we have to keep trying. I think the fact that somebody here was saying after 15 attempts, I am still going, that is not saying that BME people are not resilient. That in fact is saying we are resilient in the face of tremendous hardships and knockbacks and put downs. We are resilient. But in the 2016 research, we saw 3 patterns of behaviors amongst BME colleagues. One, there was activism. They were doing something. They were doing research, they were doing conferences, they were doing seminars and so on. And they were also engaging in brokerage. So they were doing mentoring, including when mentoring by white colleagues. They were joining professional networks, but essentially they were talking to each other. They were trying to say, well, actually, this problem we recognize, we cannot fix it on our own, and we need our white colleagues. We need to be working with our white colleagues. And that's part of the healing that Professor Woolley talked about earlier, that, you know, we have to, in addition to our activism, we have to be working with others, and let's be realistic about it. You know, tackling race inequality is a collective endeavor, and there is no way BME people can solve this problem by their own. We need our white colleagues on side, and working with them constructively and meaningfully is really crucial. So yes, I think we need more activism from everybody. Yes, I think we need brokerage and networking to be happening between white and black colleagues who get this problem. But I do think that BME colleagues, the fact that we wake up every morning and go into our institutions, that in and of itself is an act of resilience.
Thanks, Professor. I'm going to ask Professor Udi to comment as well, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Paul, for that. I just want to follow up with us identifying processes for voice magnification, because when you have an individual who is really facing challenges, the burnout and the in that struggle can be really, really high. So what I encourage people to do, I know we do have, I personally have got challenges around networks, like Black Staff networks and whatever else they're called, but it has that big advantage in having a collective voice to raise the issues. And I think by doing that, sometimes you can also save yourself from that person who is having to bang the table all the time, asking to be involved in things, to also working through a group. So that resource network is one. I also say to my BME colleagues, resilience is also about the kinds of self-development tools that you put for yourself. I have this notion of creating joy even in the midst of pain. And I say this without any apologies at all. If you want me to turn up every time because I know you are kicking my promotion document left, right, and center and be an angry woman, that's what you want to see, but I'm going to create joy even in that situation. And I can use that experience to help others, as Paul has mentioned. So there are different things that we need to do to help with building that resilience. Interacting, anything that keeps that joy, I would say keep it. I talk a lot about how you use your faith, how you use other platforms of dialogue to help you. Sometimes it may not be in your institution. What else you have out there that you can use to support your self-development, to create joy for you in the midst of the turbulence rather than allowing it to beat you up. So that would be my, and that's the kind of advice that I give to the people that I talk to.
Thank you, Professor Udi. I'm now going to move on to the next question. So Yinka, could I ask you to facilitate that, please?
Yes, happy to do so, Sanchia. We've had about 7 questions come in that are very, that we'd like to send across to you. So one of them was, how do we approach the concept of unconscious bias? The person's put here, I've come across colleagues previously who don't believe unconscious bias exists. specifically from non-white colleagues. So asking for some advice there.
Okay. Perhaps Lord Simon Woolley, can I ask you to start off?
Sorry, the sound went off again a little bit. Can you repeat the question, please?
Hi, Lord Woolley. The question was, how do we approach the subject of unconscious bias? And the attendee was saying specifically where you have non-white, non-BAME colleagues who don't believe in it.
Well, the answer to this is really a similar answer to the other one about resilience and about how we all take part in this. And that is that our white colleagues more than ever must begin to say to their black colleagues, I believe you. I want to see life through your lens. And that way we can solve some of these problems rather than having to start from go in saying, do they exist? I mean, the data screams at us. And so, we have to then find pathways for us to close the gaps. And, I would just argue again and again and again that the present pathways, have been so tame and we're just tweaking around the edges. And in regards to, this unconscious bias, I mean, that if we now agree there's structural inequalities, if we now agree that there's abundance of talent, then we've got to start from scratch and then say, look, the present pathways are not doing us justice. And we have to find a formula in which, one, we have a mechanism to spot talent, and two, it can go from A to B to Z. Oh, and by the way, it's in our interest. It's in our own interest that we have the Professor Udis at the highest level. I mean, I've seen my sister, we've been to her conferences, and I often think to myself, why isn't she at the top table? What reason on God's earth is my sister not at the top table? And Paul mentioned these subtleties. Dr. Gulce mentioned these subtleties that they will find to block her. Now, you tell your professors and you tell the leaders of this. Simon says, we're not asking for change right now. We're demanding it. Oh, and by the way, it's in your own interest.
Thank you, Lord Woolley. Jenny, I'm going to ask you to move on to the next question now, please. Sorry, before we do, Dr. Ipek just wants to make a comment there.
Thank you, Sanchia. I just wanted to include one more thing. I've seen on the comments and the question as well, that non-BME colleagues are not believing in it, this unconscious bias, but actually most of them are aware of the unconscious bias. But the fact that how to stop that, it goes through a long training as well as believing and having committed in it. And I want to give one example. It wasn't about race, that's why I didn't share it, but one of the directors in the civil service said he is aware of his unconscious bias and he applied to get a training for that and he's getting the training. But equally he said, I like working with both men and women. So I like working with women. It's not, for me, it's not different working with them. But when it comes to appoint someone, I prefer men. And this is obviously, he's aware of his unconscious bias and he's trying to change that. And I think for such an effort, we need from everyone. Because we need to be aware of the fact that we all have blind spots and we all have bias towards various issues. So we need to be aware of our bias. One thing is there are some tests to recognize that, but also we need to be constantly educating ourselves about it.
Absolutely, and we have to be open to education ourselves and recognizing that we have those biases and be willing to be on panels with people that will help us to check ourselves as well. So Jenny, please, the next question.
Hi Sanchia, Shinko, it's come back to me. The next question here, which is, has BAME/diversity become a problematic term for Black people seeking greater representation? Should I repeat that again? Has BAME, as in the term BAME/diversity, become a problematic term for people, for Black people seeking greater representation?
Sanchia, if I may jump in here.
Yes.
I think one of our biggest problems is the diversion and inclusion debate is more problematic for Black people, because under that broad umbrella, companies are saying, no, we have a unit now for diversity and inclusion. And when you drill down, it's been great for white women and shocking for Black men. I've sat on panels. I've sat on panels with myself and 4 white people. And the white people, particularly the white women, will unconsciously do somersaults to get the white woman in, way over and above. They'll exclude a Black person. He's got too much experience. He's got too little, and shoehorn. And of course, it ticks the box. And that's the same in political circles too. Political parties, the Labour Party will do somersaults to squeeze Black men and have an all women shortlist. And that all women shortlist is predominantly an all white women shortlist. And so there's a double whammy in that. BAME, yes, that can be problematic, again, for people of African and Caribbean descent, too. We have to be aware of that. I can't remember the last time the Labour Party selected a African and Caribbean man for a safe Labour seat. And so, look, in this moment of deep honesty, let's look at the facts, let's not hide behind them, and drive this agenda forward.
Thank you, Lord Woolley. Does any other panelists want to comment on that?
I wanted to come in there, Sanchia, and I think you're right, Simon. The race inequality is a stain on our society, and that is the stain we should be looking to remove from society. So all of this hokey-pokey around the terms, whether we use BME or BAME, or I've seen some new terms coming up now, ABMO, Asian, Black, Minority, Other, or Black and Global Majority, the work of Rosemary Campbell-Stevens. I think our attention really is being shifted to semantics when we talk about those things, because the real problem is, if we didn't have a problem of racism in this country, none of those terms would apply. So we need to get back to the grassroots, which is racism. Race discrimination is a huge, big stain on British society, and we need to fix it.
Thank you, Professor Miller. Yinka, I'll ask you to ask the next question now, please. Or Jenny.
Apologies there, Sanchia. So we have one question really here. It was directed at Lord Woolley. However, all the panelists may be able to feed into this. What they're asking is, if we could take one action to address race equality, what would it be?
Okay, so we'll start off with Lord Simon Woolley, and then we'll bring the other panelists.
Be bold, be brave. You don't necessarily have to do it on your own. Do it with a group of people, and couch it in a framework in which you want the organization to be bigger and better. But don't accept crumbs. Don't accept crumbs. Think big, think bold. The starting point is, this is not just for us, it's for everyone. Because we win this big battle, and it is huge. It's very important we take people along. It's easy to bash and it's easy to point the finger. And sometimes we need to do that just to get it off our chest. But the bigger goal is to take people along.
Okay, I'll ask Professor Udi to comment next, please.
Thank you very much. I think in the same spirit, Simon, it's about seizing the moment. I kid you not, if we allow this moment to slip past, we are not doing justice to ourselves as a humanity. So for me, the big thing is, let's seize the moment, let's work together, and it's going to be uncomfortable. I'm telling everybody, this cannot be comfortable. So if you're waiting for it to be comfortable, then I'm sorry, we're not doing the right thing. So seize the moment. It's going to be uncomfortable, but let's heal together collectively. The other real action is for people to demand not to be involved in things that exclude Black people. I can say that and say it again. I'm talking to College of Canons this evening, and I'm going to be saying to them, how on earth can you have all your directors of music are white when we are in charge of gospel music, for goodness sake? So I'm going to be saying to the bishops tonight, if you turn up at things and it's all white, walk away.
Walk away.
So let's start having real, bold actions that will make other people ask questions, stand up and be counted.
Thank you, Professor Udi. Time is fast spent, and so we won't be able to take any more questions, but we have saved all of the chat and we will look at all of the questions, and we just hope that this seminar has been a catalyst for you to have those discussions, but also create actions. And we do encourage all those leaders who are on the call today to actually also step up and work with us as Black colleagues to take action and to move our issues forward on the agenda. So thank you so much for staying with us for the last 2 hours, and I wish you a lovely afternoon. Thank you. And thank you to all the panelists and to all of you who have asked questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sanchia.
Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you, Sanchia. Thank you so much.